Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. In this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics, and we're going to get a big dose of politics, and particularly the politics of the media, with my guest, Batya Ungar-Sargon. She is the author of Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Batya, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I warned you that guests on this podcast introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, please imagine you have a minute or less. You've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, and you're going to tell them who you are. Please tell us who you are.
Well, for the purposes of this podcast, I would say a very important thing for your audience to know about me is that I'm a big fan of yours.
Oh, stop now.
I think that the work you're doing is so very important, and there are so few people in that space, and you've made a real mark, and you've given people like me a real ledge from which to join the good fight and push back against climate extremism when it's immiserating the poor and the working class, while also acknowledging that climate change is real and something that deserves some amount of our attention. So for the purposes of your podcast audience, I'm a big fan of Robert Bryce. I'm also the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek, where I am sometimes your editor. And I'm the author of Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy.
Well, great. Well, thank you. There was no prompting there. And yes, there is some conflict of interest here that Batya, I met her in April. We met in April at the Urban Reform Institute event in Houston. We both are friends with Joel and admirers of Joel Kotkin and his work. So let's talk about Bad News. I read it a couple of months ago. I was reviewing it again this morning, and it's a remarkable book. What led you to write it?
Well, as I often tell people, this is not actually the book that I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book about how Americans are a lot less polarized than we think, and that political polarization is really an elite phenomenon. You know, people who are not making money off of polarization are not polarized. And you get out of, the media and political centers in America, you get out into the heartland, you just, Democrats, Republicans working side by side. Nobody cares how anybody votes. So I wanted to write a book about that. And I couldn't sell it. I was very, very, very depressed about it because this was sort of this truth that I thought that our nation really needed to hear. And finally, this was the last outing I went on before the lockdown. I had drinks with a friend and a conservative editor. And she very kindly sort of heard me out. And she said to me, well, the reason you're not getting anywhere selling this is because, maybe it's true that Americans are not that polarized, but then why do I think that they are? Maybe you should write that book. And I think that is actually the book that Bad News is, because what I found was that, the reason that we think we're so polarized is because there are people making a lot of money off of convincing us that we are. But that at the end of the day, the real divide in America is not actually even a political divide. It's about class, and it's about who is benefiting from that class divide versus who is paying for it. So much comes down to that. And certainly the reason our media is so bad and why the left-wing media is so woke is about class more than it is about politics. That's the argument I make in the book.
Well, that was one of the things that in fact, I wrote it down just before we got online, was that if I were going to summarize your book, I'd say that you're writing primarily about class. And I think, Joel Kotkin, I've mentioned him before. Joel writes a lot about this, and particularly in light of California. So you've said it yourself that the book is about class. But let me ask about the word woke, because I don't like that word. And in fact, I wrote a piece I was commissioned to write a piece about California and energy policy in California. And I used the word woke climate policy. And my wife read it and said, take that word out. That word it's a divisive word. So why is that the right word here in this title for your book? Because that's the key part of your argument that you're making. What is woke, and why is this a problem?
It's a really important question. The problem with the word woke is that it was appropriated from Black slang The word in the 70s and 80s was Black slang for, stay woke meant be aware of systemic racism, be aware of the ways in which the state still sponsors racism, mass incarceration, police brutality, segregation in our public schools. These are really important things to be aware of and really important things for every American of conscience to care about. Indeed, there's no longer a partisan divide about these issues. The last person to endorse mass incarceration who is on our political scene right now was Joe Biden, and the last person to fight it and release 5,000 Black men from prison was President Trump. So, the divide that we're used to thinking about in terms of, who cares about these issues that are impacting Americans descended from slaves specifically, that systemic racism that we've had throughout our history and that persists sadly to this day in certain tendrils. There's no longer a partisan divide about the need to address these things with some urgency. Today, the way I use woke is we've appropriated a term that the Black community used to talk about something very importantly. And I think it's a very legitimate critique to have appropriated a word that was used to speak to something very important. And now we're using it to describe something bad. So that is for sure a legitimate critique. And I think if my book had been published by a liberal publishing house, probably the word woke wouldn't have been in the title. It would have been something about class. But the reason I feel that it is legitimate to use it, and the reason I feel that it is, I'm proud of the fact that it's in the title, is I'm using it the way sociologists use it. So there's now, a number of sociologists, 3 or 4, who have whose work endorses each other, and they pointed out something that they call the Great Awakening. Now, yes, that is an appropriation, but what they're describing is something real and something that happened and something that the word woke actually does really fit to describe. What did they notice? They noticed that starting around 2015, white liberals began to have views on race that were more extreme than the views of Blacks and Latinos. So the people that their, views on race are ostensibly on behalf of, their views ceased to reflect how those people think about race themselves and became this new thing. So what is this new thing? I'll give you one example from Pew. So the Pew Research Center this year did a study where they asked, one of the questions that they sort of were trying to divide Americans into the different tribes. Mm-hmm. And one of the tribes that they found was, progressives. Okay, so who are the progressives? The progressives are people who, for example, when you put the following proposition to them, they say yes. The proposition is this: America's institutions are so deeply racist that they cannot be reformed. The only solution is to raze them to the ground and rebuild them from the bottom up. So 91% of progressives said yes to that. Okay, but it happens to be that not only are only 6% of Americans in that progressive camp, but it is the whitest and the most highly educated and the most affluent of all the camps within the Democratic subgroups. Now, you'll never guess how many Black Americans were in that group of people who said, over 91% of them said America's institutions are so deeply racist, they must be razed to the ground and rebuilt from the bottom up. Just 6% of Black Americans are in that group. That is wokeness. It's what happens when white liberals get their hands on a racial obsession and start to think and talk about race in a way that simply does not reflect how Blacks and Hispanics talk about race, the people that they're ostensibly advocating on behalf of. I'll just give one more example because I think it's a really important point and question. In 2018, there was a Yale study that came out that found that there was a difference in how white liberals and white conservatives talk to Blacks and Hispanics. What's the difference? White liberals, when they encounter a person of color, they dumb down their vocabulary. They present lower competence in order to ostensibly protect these minorities from their big vocabularies. And white conservatives don't do that. What makes you do that? What makes a person who's a liberal, who thinks they're on the compassionate side, they're on the right side of history, they're the ones who care about minorities, dumb down their vocabulary? Literally, you see a person who has darker skin color than you, and you assume that you stereotype them as lower status, lower education, lower income, and in need of protection from you, in need of your beneficence, your protection, your paternalism. That is wokeness. And maybe that's the wrong word to describe it, but that phenomenon is real and it is infecting so many of our liberal institutions. And we have to have a way to talk about it.
Well, so, okay. So how would you describe your politics? Because Newsweek, I've read many of the things you've written, and this book was published by Encounter Press. Is that right? Which is notably conservative press.
Yes.
How do you describe your politics?
I would call myself a left-wing populist.
So you consider yourself a leftist, but if I were going to look at your book and think, well, this is clearly a conservative wrote this, right? Because it's very kind of and it's a conservative book publisher, but I would, it's a little surprising to hear you say that. I'm not arguing with you, but my perception of the way the book was written was that, oh, you're a conservative and you're calling out in particular the news industry for its class bias and so on. But so a leftist populist, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I even sometimes will call myself like a Marxist or a socialist. Sometimes
Really?
if I'm like in a really trolly mood, I'll be like, I'm a Trump socialist because I feel like Trump's economic agenda was so far left. It was further left than what Bernie Sanders was proposing in 2015.
How do you
And
mean?
he
How do
accomplished
you mean that? That's an interesting point. What do you mean?
Okay, getting rid of NAFTA, starting a trade war with China, imposing tariffs.
I got you.
Policing the border. These used to be left-wing propositions, right?
Well, and they're pro-working class. I mean, those were things that, right, that NAFTA, the ideas around NAFTA that and around immigration, right, that and, numerous authors have pointed this out, that in fact, what are the Democrats doing if they're interested in protecting workers? Well, then you don't want free trade. You want to protect domestic American industry, and that I think that's a really interesting point that Trump is a Republican, but this is also the switch in the two parties, which you also talked about, right? That the Democrats are really the party of, as I see it, the party of the elites, and Trump spoke to something in terms to the poor and the working class that made
100%.
the Republican Party much more the representative of the poor and the working class than the Democrats, even though traditionally that's not been their own view of themselves. Is that fair?
Totally. So to me, if somebody says to me, these are conservative talking points, I sort of feel like, well, first of all, that's not an insult. Like some of my best friends are conservatives. Like I don't buy that it's insulting to be called a conservative. I know they mean it that way, but I don't accept it that way. But I would say, like, yeah, if you to the extent that the left wants to say that caring about class is now a conservative proposition, fine. Then I'm on whatever side thinks that class is the number one issue in America that we have to talk about, that it's causing all of our problems, and that we've abandoned the working class. If the left wants to say that, like, the right is now the side that cares about the working class, okay, then I guess I'm on the right. I think these words don't mean anything anymore. But I think because they've become so elitist on the left, they do say that. They do think that it's right wing to care about the working class. And that to me is ceding the fight. Like, why would I allow them to define caring about class out of the left? Like, if you know what I mean? Okay, yeah, it's true. They've kicked me, officially out of the left. Like, lefties, they hate me. That's fine. I don't care about that. But I'm like, that to me is, you've ceded the ground to the populist right. You've said there's no room for populism on the left. There's no room to care about the working class on the left. Fine. If you want to never rule again, you want to, fine. You know what I mean? Like, I don't.
So they're marginalizing themselves with a large group of voters. And I think that's right. And I look at a lot of this through the climate and energy lens, obviously. And what do I see? It's elite coastal organizations, NGOs that have massive amounts of money, far more than the fossil fuel interests who they continually demonize. And yet there's no pushback from the news media on the regressive effect of these policies, whether it's, natural gas bans or electric vehicle mandates or, all these things. They do nothing for the carpenter and the carpet layers and the bricklayers and the landscape guys. This all punishes them. but somehow that isn't discussed in at all in the major media outlets, from what I can see. Is that how you see it? I mean,
Yeah, 100%. And the reason it's not discussed is not politics, it's class. And I think, the French economist Thomas Piketty really pointed this out when he said that it used to be that the left was the side of the working class and the right was the side of the rich. Today, the left is the side of the elites focused increasingly on environmentalism, and the right is the side of the working class focused increasingly on immigration, right? Because those are the things each side cares about. When you have nothing left to care about from an economic point of view, you start looking around for vanity morals, and you land on things like defund the police, forgiving $50,000 in student loans, and environmental extremism, because you have no real struggle left in your life to give your life meaning. And so that's sort of the new frontier, and that's happening across Europe. I mean, what's happening in the Netherlands right now totally fits into this farmers strike,
It is remarkable. And they're dumping manure on,
Totally.
border crossings, and the farmers are saying, what the hell are you doing here? I mean, but it's the same with the yellow vest movement in France, right? Where the working class are not just protesting, they're shutting down the economies in these countries because they're saying, where is the equity here? Where is the social equity? Where do we fit into the society here? I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and the truckers' protest in Canada also, I think, fit right into this.
Right. So let me bring it back to, because your book really is about the media, and full disclosure, I come from the left, right? That was where I started in journalism as a liberal, right? But and I used to think the liberal media that was a myth. Well, no longer. But let me. No, I'm serious. I mean, I after looking at it and being in the media, I mean, this is my whole career, more than 30 years. I thought, oh well, it's a myth, but no. I'm clear. It's clear to me that it is. There is liberal media, but this is one of the things that in the first pages of your book, you said journalism, and I think this is a really important point, and I want to discuss it at length here. Journalism has become a profession of astonishing privilege over the past century, metamorphosing from a blue-collar trade into one of the occupations with the most highly educated workforces in the United States. And along with this status revolution has come the radicalization of the profession on questions of identity, leaving in the dust anything commensurate to a similar concern with economic inequality. Once a blue-collar trade, journalism becomes something akin to an impenetrable caste. And what journalists have done with that power, perhaps inadvertently, is to wage a cultural battle that enhances their own economic interests against a less educated and struggling American working class. The only thing that I would add to that is that that is also mirrored or mimicked in the urban-rural divide, because I see that in the same terms, right? Where the rural areas aren't as affluent, but they are the Trump voters, right? But how did you come to that conclusion? Because walk us through that if you don't mind, because I think I wanted to read that section from Joseph Pulitzer and the penny newspapers and the working, and how they were the early pioneers in newspapering were attuned with the working class, and the reporters were working class, lived with the working class. Talk about that, because I think that's important to understand that history, and you did it very well in the book.
Yeah, for like the vast majority of American journalism, like our rich history of journalism up until the 20th century, the late 20th century and 21st century, the kind of people who became journalists were like the kid who sat in the back of the classroom cracking wise, who had a real problem with authority, who didn't think that the teacher had any right to tell anybody what to do, who was so anti-authoritarian that they couldn't go work in the factory with everybody else because they would have been dangerous, right? Because they couldn't take orders. And so they became a journalist. It was like a very low status job. And when they got there, they were just as anti-authoritarian. They would sit there and they would see their job as like, it is my job to demand justice on behalf of the little guy. All of my friends who I went to school with, who now work in the factory and I live next door to them, I get to meet important people. I get to meet, millionaires and politicians. And what I'm going to do with that opportunity is represent my people, who are the little guy, who's the working class. It was a very low status job. You didn't really have to get a college degree. Most journalists didn't have a college degree. Most journalists lived in working class neighborhoods, and it was a high blue collar job. They made maybe a little bit more than their neighbor, the lineman or the electrician, right? today, the kind of person who becomes a journalist is like the kid who sits in the front row of the classroom, and every time the teacher asks a question, they're me. The teacher has to pretend they can't see them because like they do all the homework every time. They go to Ivy League schools. Their parents are already, in the upper middle class, if not, the elites. They end up, with a college degree for sure. Over 92% of journalists have a college degree. Most of them now have a graduate degree, none of which, by the way, makes you a better journalist. And that's who becomes a journalist now. People go to the Ivies, the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, these people who are supposed to be lefty, these people at the forefront of this identity crap, this like, at the forefront of every one of these defund the police, everything, right? They are taking their interns from the top 1% of universities. Okay. And so it used to be you had like a thriving local journalism where journalists were still working class, right? They still didn't make that much, but that all, Craigslist put that out of commission, right? Like Craigslist was like the death of the local newspaper industry, right? Now 75% of journalism jobs are on the coasts. They're national outlets, digital outlets, right? And so you had this status revolution among journalists themselves, and it met an industry that was shifting towards digital media, that shifted from, the incentives being to get the widest possible audience to the incentives being to get the most elite audience possible, because their data is the data that it is the most beneficial to collect. And that's how newspapers are making their money now. So,
if I can interrupt, because you made an important point there. And when I was starting in journalism, the way you made it as a reporter, you would start in a small town newspaper.
Exactly.
But the death of the small town newspapers, I saw something, maybe it was something you had written recently about the newspapers closing at a rate of 2 a week or something like that, they still exist. And I get a lot of my data for land use conflicts from small town newspapers. I comb them. I use Google News alerts, but so that it's not just the decline of actual print media on paper. It's the closure of rural newspapers or non-major urban outlet newspapers that's concentrating that journalism as a business in big coastal cities. I think you said 4 or 5 cities that just completely dominate the media business. New York, Los Angeles, Boston, maybe Chicago, I don't know where else, maybe, Houston, not really, but that dominance is also part of that stratification of society, rural, urban, college educated, non-college educated, but that loss of the working class sensibility by the people who are doing the reporting that's the main one of your main points about. But okay, so let me ask the question. So tell us about Pulitzer and that history. How Pulitzer made his fortune and how that laid the groundwork for the newspapers that became the dominant ones for in the century past.
Yeah, so Joseph Pulitzer was actually the second sort of godfather of American journalism. The first was this guy, Benjamin Day, who really fell into it by accident. He was he was apprenticed by his father as a printer when he was 14 years old. That was very normal. He never went to high school, and he sort of arrived in New York City in 1829. And there was a lot of work for printers at that time. There were newspapers, but they were all for the elites. So there were political newspapers for the political elites, and then there were business newspapers for the business elites. And he kind of realized he was living in a very poor neighborhood, and he realized that the poor in America, it was very unique at the time. Most of them could read. There was already by 1829 a literacy rate of over 90%. It was the first country in the world, in the history of the world, where if you stopped a stranger in the street, you could be reasonably certain that they knew how to read. And they were spending their money on reading materials. They were endlessly curious. The city was covered in print, just, people hanging up flyers, posters, and they would buy these, for a penny, you could buy, a gallows confession or a romance or, a humorous tract or a religious tract. There was a lot of stuff for sale on the streets for poor people to read. And that was what they spent their extra money on. And so Benjamin Day realized this, and, he was also, getting poorer and poorer. For some reason, he wanted to start his own printing shop, but he was finding it very difficult. Then there was a cholera epidemic, the economy crashed, and he thought to himself, okay, what if I, advertise my printing business, but make it look like a newspaper, but I'm going to target the masses with it. And I'm going to charge a penny for it and sell it on the streets. You couldn't buy a newspaper on the streets before then. For the elites, they would buy a $10 subscription to the newspaper of their choice. But, if you think about it, like a domestic servant would make $5 a month in 1829. So she's not going to spend 2 months' salary on a newspaper that has like nothing in it for her. Benjamin Day wanted to make a newspaper that the masses would buy, which meant selling it at a price they could buy, and also including in it stuff that was relevant to them. So the first thing he did was he hired someone to sit in the daybreak court, to go in at 4 a.m. and take down the stories. Like the cops would bring in, everybody they had arrested overnight. And these people, they'd arrested from like, the demi-monde of like New York City would tell their story to the judge, and he hired this guy, George Wisner, to take all this down, and then he would put it in the paper. And my God, I mean, those papers just, the newsies, he hired all these like young urchins to sell them on the paper. They just sold out every single day. I mean, he got rich off of this in 5 years. And he sold it, and then he moved on, and he never thought about the newspaper business again. But he started this revolution called the penny press. He was instantly imitated by, tons of other people, because they realized that there was a huge market here for news that was relevant to the masses. And Pulitzer basically took this and ran with it. I mean, he was a total genius for this, for figuring out that if you cater to the masses, if you make them feel seen and heard and represent them, they will reward you. They may only have 2 pennies, but they'll give you one of them. And that revolution, I mean, and here's the thing, though, this is very important. These papers were not nonpartisan, okay? They were extremely partisan, but they were partisan on behalf of the working class and the masses. So they would print like union demands in full, and they were constantly demanding better conditions, better wages. They were very partisan, but they were partisan on behalf of the masses. The problem with today's media is not that it's partisan, it's that it's partisan on behalf of the elites. You have the right, the conservative media is, I'm not talking about podcasts and daytime talk, but like the legacy, the conservative media is partisan on behalf of the top 5% of conservatives, and the legacy media on the left is partisan on behalf of the elites that we've been talking about this whole time, the overeducated, coastal elites, the top 10%, people making over $150,000 a year. And there's no one speaking to 90% of Americans. I mean, I think actually the podcast industry now is really blowing up, podcasts and YouTube shows. And if you look at the ones that have millions and millions of listeners, of viewers, they are catering to a working class audience. I mean, people are finding new material to listen to. But our legacy media is, the problem with it is not that half of it is for Republicans and half is for Democrats. The problem is that, 98% of it is for the top 10%.
As you're saying that, one of the things when I started in journalism, I was pitching to newspapers, I was pitching to magazines, and the people who are the experts saying, well, look at the ads, look at the advertisements, and if you look at the advertisements, you know who the audience is for that publication.
Absolutely.
Well, so I'm a regular subscriber to the Wall Street Journal. I was a subscriber to the New York Times, but you pick up the Times or the Times Magazine, Mercedes, Mikimoto, right? Very high end, and the same was the Journal as well, right? But high end watches, expensive stuff, right? That those are their advertisers. Well, that's who their readers are. Then the readers that they're targeting are the wealthy. But you make some really interesting point here about the division in, where is it? I'm looking for my, you say the defining feature of conservative media is not that it endorses conservative politics, but that it stepped into a class lacuna created by the mainstream press's abandonment of the working class. And you say 29%, Rush Limbaugh's dead now, 29% of Limbaugh's audience and 24% of the Fox News audience had graduated, only just 9%, just 24% had graduated from college. 54% of daytime talk show listeners only had a high school degree or less. So that there's an educational divide, there's a class divide, there's a geographic divide. And now it seems to me that, and it's one of the things you address in the book as well, is this stratification of the media where Fox talks more to the working class, and the CNN and the others, MSNBC, are talking to the liberal urban class. And so let me ask the question. So how do we bridge that? Or can we bridge it? I mean, you talk about it at the end of your book about what some possible solutions are, but it seems like a really intractable problem because it's developed over decades, and it seems like this silo siloification, this balkanization of the media has only gotten more extreme.
I think we think it's much worse than like Americans think it is. Like Americans are not too bothered by that. We are, because we want to be able to impact the people on the other side and force them to have our views. So Pew just had a study showing the difference between how journalists see their work and how Americans see their work. And it was just very funny. Like journalists are very bothered by the fact, especially liberal journalists, that, conservatives won't listen to them and won't read their papers and won't watch their TV shows. But the American people are not too bothered by that. They don't take this very seriously. The news is not very important to them, and politics is not very important to them, and it shouldn't be. Our political system has ceased to represent the people that elect, these people. I mean, there's just total logjam in Congress, especially on the things that, have total, 85% of Americans want. There's just very little representation anymore. And I think that it's just like, we care a lot about what's in the news and what's in politics because we're in the elites. And so like, it's very relevant to our lives, but this is, we've lost the Benjamin Day and Joseph Pulitzer thing of realizing like that this is totally irrelevant to the lives of the vast majority of Americans. I mean, 2/3 of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. What the hell do they care about what's happening in Ukraine? What the hell do they care about misinformation? Let me tell you, like, I can't remember the last time I asked somebody, so what is the biggest struggle you're facing today? And they were like, misinformation, but if you ask journalists, of course, they're like obsessed with misinformation because they think they should have the right to tell people what to care about and what to think. And they don't have that right. And so I don't feel like the siloization is like that. I mean, as part of my job, I watch Fox News and CNN all day, pretty much. I just have them up on two screens and I'm just following the conversation as it goes along with, Twitter and like seeing where things are going. So I know which op-eds to commission. And, I just don't feel that it's so, you'll never see the border crisis covered on CNN, almost ever. That's covered every day on Fox. You'll never see crime rarely covered on CNN. It's covered almost every day on Fox, so it's like, well, at some point you're like, okay, well, but then there are things Fox won't cover, right? It actually, contrary to popular opinion, it has been running the January 6th committee hearings, right? When they run during the day, the whole thing. I don't know why journalists are allowed to lie about that on Twitter, but there's a meme going around that Fox isn't covering it, but there's a lot of stuff, that Trump did that was not great, that did not get a lot of coverage on Fox, and but does it really matter if like everything does have its outlet? I mean, in a way, I feel like that's really good, because when I look at what happened with the trucker convoy in Canada and I look at what's happening in the Netherlands now, the media is so on the side of the leftist elites. There's no Fox News. There's no countervailing force. So the media has been, it smeared the truckers in Canada. Like 95% of Canadian media smeared the truckers as fascists and Nazis. There was no countervailing force to say, no, this is a labor strike. Like, why is the left not on the side of the biggest labor strike in living memory? And the same thing is now happening with the farmers. They're being, smeared as extremists when millions and millions of people in the Netherlands support them and support what they're doing. And like, they're literally being instructed to kill off cattle when we're already struggling with meat shortages because of the war in Ukraine, but there's no media countervailing force. So in a way, I feel a little bit like, is this really that bad? And is it really that bad because I think it's becoming more and more clear how distant the democratic elites are from the people they purport to represent. And as long as you have one side, Fox covering the issues that are relevant to the working class, does it matter that much that, the liberals have created a little echo chamber for themselves where they can, cancel culture each other out of, positions of elite power?
So you're saying the consumers are going to find the news that they want, right? That despite this balkanization, they're going to find it. Well, so let me push back here a little bit because I looked you up. So you have a doctorate, as I understand, in the 18th century novel from Cal Berkeley. So you have a PhD. You're Dr. Batya Ungar-Sargon. So aren't you one of the elites? Yes,
of course. Yes.
So, but does that give you a better vantage point then? Or how do you square your own elitism, I guess, with your critique of the elite, I guess, would be a provocative question or the way to think about it.
I think one of the things that broke my heart about the truckers convoy in Canada was that they did not have any access to the elite conversation. Like we've siloed, we have a caste system. and I am in the caste that is causing the problem. Like, it's very hard for me to think like how many people outside that caste can really make a compelling case against it. I mean, if they don't know it, if they haven't been there, like, I remember I know what's wrong with academia because I went through it. Like, I could tell you where things are going wrong. Like, it's like, how could you criticize something deeply if you haven't experienced it? I mean, you can, like, morally, but I used to be woke. Like, I know what it feels like, which means like I can also do a better job of like, I don't think these people are cynical. I think they're just devastatingly wrong, but from like a very sincere place. Like, I look at AOC, with the Green New Deal. I think that thing is terrible and dangerous and would replace tons of good paying union jobs with like crappy green jobs that pay, $12 an hour. I think it's really bad for the working class, but I don't for a second think that she's doing it cynically. She clearly believes it and clearly is trying to make the world a better place to the best of her ability. She's just very wrong. But I think it's
because of that disconnection of not know. Yeah. I feel lucky in that in my job I travel a lot and I speak to a lot of electric cooperatives. So I spend a fair amount of time in rural America. I meet farmers. I meet people who are small town merchants, and I hear and know them. I mean, these are people I can call up and talk to. But what I'd feed back to you is it sounds like you got a PhD, you went to Cal Berkeley, you've seen that academia, and that's the part that I see in the academic and the clerisy, to introduce a word that you cite and credit to Joel Kotkin, that there is the clerisy is completely disconnected from those working class people, from the people who work with their hands, the welders, the farmers, the people, the producers, and this disconnect is only getting deeper because of this class divide, geographic divide, etc. So talk about the clerisy, and you use that word and you cite Kotkin. Who is the clerisy?
The clerisy is the people. We used to be journalists used to be part of a fourth estate, right? Outside, the job is to be outside of power, demanding justice, right? Like a perspective from outside of the caste system where you could say like, okay, here's what's really going on, and like demand justice on behalf of the lower class.
Speaking truth to power.
Exactly. Today, because of this new caste system, journalists are part of an elite that go to the same universities as the politicians who they then end up covering, as the tech billionaires who they're supposed to be distant from. And they live in the same neighborhoods, and their kids go to the same schools as all of the people who are running things, all of the people who are in that top, 10% who, they have, even they're in the top 10% economically, but in terms of power, they control massive amounts of power, and it's self-justifying. So you saw this really clearly with COVID. They mistake their economic privilege for some sort of divine right of kings, like a kind of morality. They think that they are more moral. You see this with COVID. You see this with environmentalism, right? Like we were talking before, right? The environmental extremism is both a product of and a cause of, class privilege, right? Like you've run out of, you're no longer worrying about how you're going to put meat on the table because you can afford it if the price goes up. Suddenly you start demanding things that are going to make the price go up even higher because you'll always be able to afford it, right? They're not like satisfied with that. They then misinterpret what is class privilege as a kind of virtue, right? They are the virtuous for caring about the climate. How dare you not care about the climate? Why are we even having this conversation? They'll say like the planet's not even going to be here in 10 years, like how could you not be on our side, right? This is the same thing with COVID, the class that was able to immediately start working from home, instead of being like, thank God I can stay home and protect my children and my mother and my elderly parents. I am going to be so grateful to everybody who has to go out and brave the plague and make sure that this class difference between us to where I'm safe and they're in the plague ends as soon as possible. No, They misinterpreted their class privilege, again, as virtue, right? We are the virtuous ones who stay home and slow the spread and wear 3 masks and blah, 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 right? That move of misinterpreting class privilege as virtue, that is, I think, what Joel's talking about when he talks about the clerisy, right? That they believe that there's something not divine, they're not religious, right? Which is a big part of the problem, if you ask me. But, that there's something, good, something that makes them good. They've misinterpreted being rich with being good. And I think that is the thing that's like very important to call out.
It's interesting you say that about religion, and because at the end of the book you also talk about you want people to be more engaged in churches and synagogues. But I also looked you up. You're from Gaza. And I've never met anybody.
No, I'm not actually from Gaza. No, it's like I don't know what people tell it to me, but Jews actually can't really go to Gaza. It's very dangerous. There's no Jews there. Yeah.
Well, there were before. Well, but that was a while ago. So, okay. Yes. Well, forgive me.
I'm definitely not from Gaza. Yes.
Okay. Forgive me. So then, but were you born in Israel or?
No. I was born in Philly. Then I grew up in Boston, and then I went to high school in Israel. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So forgive me.
That's okay.
Well, so then, but talk about that then. Has that going to high school in Israel, how did that form your politics or your worldview, or how did that affect you?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I never even thought about that. I mean, definitely like looking at the way the conversation about Israel plays out in America, having grown up there, like having deep ties to Israeli Jews, but also to Palestinians living in the territories. You see like how much people want to misinterpret things if it makes them feel, good about themselves. So I think that's that. But, my opinions about the conflict have shifted over time. And, I think for a lot of people, it's, the more you think about things, the more deeply you think about things, it's death to keep thinking the same thing. You have to be aware and awake and constantly questioning yourself and, your positions and trying to understand things from a deeper and deeper point of view.
So I'm in no way an expert. I've been to Israel twice, but how important were the Abraham Accords? Because for all there was the overwhelming amount of media coverage of Trump was negative, right? But from what I've seen, what Jared Kushner was able to accomplish was pretty remarkable. Again, as someone who's pretty much a neophyte, what was your view on that? I mean, this is far afield from bad news. And by the way, my station break, my guest is Batya Ungar-Sargon. Her new book is Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. So since we started talking about Israel, I just wanted to put that in as a question that occurred to me. How important was Kushner's work, and is this going to be enduring in terms of this seemingly never-ending conflict in the Middle East?
Yeah, it was extremely important. I think for a lot of Palestinians, it was very devastating because they understood that their former allies had put them on the back burner. It used to be that all these countries refused to normalize relations with Israel because of the occupation. And now that's no longer the case. And Israel, as a result, is in a much better position and no longer needs America as much, by the way. And so to me, it's sort of like, is it so important that America be, it's going to be the case that at some point America is no longer necessary to Israel as its, number one ally because it has normalized relations with other extremely powerful countries. So that is definitely going to change like the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's going to change how Israel plays out in terms of American politics. But yeah, it was extremely, extremely important because countries that were sort of, look, it wasn't like Israel was at war with like the UAE. There was tons of like back channel cooperation and things like that, but it couldn't be acknowledged. And now there are just billions and billions and billions of dollars connecting those countries. And that's just going to totally change how things play out. It's going to change, it totally changed the Palestinians' position. And, it's not like things were moving before that. But it put the Palestinians in a position where they have essentially no bargaining power anymore because the threats that they could have issued or whatever, the support that they had to back up those threats are gone. So you cannot be overstated how important the Abraham Accords were, what a huge achievement they were, but also, devastating to many in the Palestinian community. And, in terms of, as somebody who cares deeply about ending the occupation, one has to think like, okay, well, what now is where do we go from here? I will also say though, Jared Kushner himself is personally enriching himself very much after the fact with, the proceeds of having established these connections. And, that seems to be the norm in America, to where, you look at someone like Hunter Biden, for example, right? Like using politics in order to further enrich your family. But, that's not, I think the Abraham Accords are objectively a good thing. I was really grateful for them. I think a lot of Jews felt very, very this is going to change things for the better. But number one, I feel conflicted about people making money off of it, and number two, I would say, what is our message to the Palestinians? How are we going to make sure that there is an equitable solution there now that they have lost a lot of their bargaining chips?
Well, and it looks like the Israelis are going to normalize potentially with the Saudis, which is remarkable. So now you have the Jewish state with the Shia aligned, and then with the Sunnis against the Shia Iranians, and isolates potentially the Iranians further. But by normalizing with the Abraham Accords, of memory serves, with Qatar and UAE, that potentially the Saudis are next. I mean, that could be just enormous. It was the Israeli ambassador was recently in Saudi Arabia, or I saw a headline of that, something to that effect. Yeah. But to me, that's one of the other examples. And my politics, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm disgusted, right? But for all of the things that happened under Trump, what Trump did, and in fact have some very positive outcomes, but particularly when it comes to the energy part, that's the part where I see, to go back to that part about the issues around the Democratic Party today, their complete disconnect with understanding how important the cost of gasoline is to voters. And we're going to find out in November about just how big this, the backlash is to this kind of what I would say woke climate policy. But is this a permanent shift? I mean, it's hard to say, of course, but that the two parties kind of shifting positions, where the Democrats are controlled by the elites and the oligarchs, whereas the Republicans are more identifying with the working class. Is that going to survive? And for how long? Or do you think this is temporary?
I think it definitely depends on who's going to be the Republicans' nominee in 2024. If it's someone like Nikki Haley, I mean, she's just a kind of old school. Or if
Trump runs again.
I don't think it will be Trump, but DeSantis, in some ways he has carried on a lot of Trump's populist energy, but I don't know if he's willing to go. I mean, Trump really, from an economic point of view, like I said before, I mean, he really broke the mold. He went further than any Democrat has gone in terms of being leading from a lefty point of view, for 50 years. I mean, he really, who would have he was such a horrible person, but he did so many good things, but it's
as a proponent for the working class.
Exactly. And there is a lot of energy for that on the right now, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, even Mitt Romney, that model from Utah is very, there's a lot of welfare support in Utah. So I think that there's just, it depends which the Republican Party is right now has a really interesting split going on. And people think that the split is over January 6th. It's not. It's over economics. It's over populism. It's over whether they want to go back to the Mitch McConnell model of free markets and, Chamber of Commerce, all of this stuff, or whether they want to head into, lean into the Trump voter and what they were going to Trump for, which was, NAFTA, deaths of despair. How do we combat those? How do we restore the dignity of the American family? How do we return to a place where a man can support his family on a single income, right? All of these questions. But if you ask me, who's my money on? Are the Democrats more likely to return to caring about these issues and these people, or are the Republicans more likely to lean into their voters and abandon their donors? I think my money would be on the Republicans. I mean, just because there's nothing commensurate happening on the Democrat side. There's nothing commensurate. And if you look, I think Build Back Better is a really great example of this. To them, that's their big, building up the middle class. But you talk to Americans and there's nothing there that they're interested in, so it's just this farce of activism that is totally just about their own egos.
Well, when I looked at Build Back Better, and I look at it, of course, through energy and climate related stuff, it looked to me like just a big ball of corporate giveaways. I mean, whether it was electric vehicles or, more subsidies for wind and solar or all these other things that had nothing to do with, high paying jobs. I mean, they talk about jobs, they give lip service to the job issue, but that wasn't fundamentally what I saw. And what I saw was just massive amounts of spending that would have turbocharged this, what I see as a land grab in rural America for wind and solar and big corporations bullying small towns and the rest of it. So what are you writing on these days? Or you got another book in mind? I hate that question when people ask me because I've written 6, they're incredibly hard. Do you have another idea in mind, or are you letting it simmer for a while?
I'm working on my next book. And,
can you tell us about it?
Not yet.
Okay.
But I'm going to ask you for help.
Okay. Happy to help any way I can.
I'm not ready to announce it yet, but it is the book that I kept reaching for while I was promoting Bad News, that didn't yet exist. And so I was like, you know what, girl, just write it. So yeah, I'll hopefully be able to announce it soon.
And do you have a contract, or are you still in the formulation stage?
No, but I'm already reporting it and traveling a lot and, excited about it. And yeah.
Well, that's good, because my experience is that the next book grew out of the last book, that it seemed like a natural progression from what you'd written before. And that, now I can build on that with a different subject or different focus. So just a couple more minutes here, and then I'll let you go. Again, my guest is Batya Ungar-Sargon. She's written a terrific book, one that was, to me, fairly surprising. It's called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. At the end of the book, you talk about the need for more engagement across the aisle, across the divide. And frankly, I'll tell you, I've had a hard time of that here in Austin, Texas. It's a famously liberal town, and I come from the liberal left. And yet, when I write about these issues, I've been roundly rejected by and lost friendships from, people are, you just don't see the world right. Energy is supposed to be more expensive. And I'm like, no, who are you talking to? What are you doing? This is terrible for the poor and the middle class. But you talk about the need to re-engage in churches, synagogues. You talk about she said, become a champion for the opinions you don't like. You're championing your own future and those of your children. So does that start in civic associations and churches? In synagogues? Where does that start for you?
Well, for me, it starts like every minute of every day that you're on your phone or on social media or encountering opinions you don't like. Like I like to say, like every time you're on the internet and you see an opinion from a stranger and it makes you feel enraged, like, oh, how dare somebody think this? Like, every time you have that feeling about a stranger, someone just made $1 million. This is how, the whole Silicon Valley model of like engagement, it's built to enrage you. Every algorithm is created to make you hate strangers, and they are making millions of dollars every time you feel that way. And so you can deprive them of that money. Every time you see an opinion you don't like, you can just say to yourself, I'm feeling this way about a stranger. It is not natural to feel this level of emotional investment in a stranger. Somebody made me feel this way so they can make money, and I can say no to that. And I think that is so important because, like a democracy is built on the fact that we have different opinions, right? Tolerance for the opinions of people you disagree with. And, especially now at a time when like Roe v. Wade is again in play, not even in play, right? Like the question of abortion is now going to play out in the most democratic way, right. At the smallest level of government. Like buck up and get ready to convince your fellow Americans, because coercing them into accepting a standard that they don't agree with is no longer on the table, right? But this is the work of sustaining our democracy, of enhancing our democracy and making sure that it survives.
Yeah, and you quoted Michael Lind, who lives here in Austin, and what did he say? It was something to the effect of that this politics is messy, and this requires that kind of engagement, continuous engagement, and the battle in the public sphere for trying to come to some agreeable policies that don't estrange all of us from each other. So a couple of last things. One of the questions I had here, and I just wanted to pose to you before, why is the New York Times so powerful?
I don't think it is.
Really? Or is it just that its power has declined tremendously
Yeah.
over the last few years?
Yeah,
So
only-
why was it so powerful, and why has its power been undermined
It was
or
powerful
reduced?
because it was the paper of record and because it worked assiduously to make sure that it was a paper that any American could pick up and see and accept what's reported there as having been processed through the highest standards of journalism. And that is very obviously no longer the case. 91% of people who read the New York Times now are Democrats. It took a lot of work for them to squander their legacy to the point where only 9% of their readers are Republicans. I mean, it's just a disaster what's happened there. And, they've really harmed the industry more generally because they're, a lot of Americans now they'll look at it. If they see that it's from the New York Times, that is already a knock against it because, and this is not, it's not just people like me. I was speaking to a guy who he was interviewing me. His job is to advise investors from this, like one of these, multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar hedge fund companies. They invest retirement funds, very big responsibility. And his job is to read the news and tell, the investors what they can expect, what to bet on, what to bet against, to the best of his ability.
Right.
And he told me, and this is a totally nonpartisan guy, his number one job is to protect other people's money. So he has no reason to not, be as objective as possible. He told me that to him, the New York Times is an activist paper. And he is always telling his investors, you have to take everything you read there with a grain of salt because it is so ideological at this point. That happened in the last 5 years, 10 years, and it's a disaster and it's tragic. I mean, I read the New York Times every day of my life, my adult life, starting when I was 18 years old, every single day until about, 2 years ago. I just couldn't anymore. And it's a disaster. But I think that it has squandered its legacy and is no longer able to.
And why did it squander it? Why and how? What was it? Just that it became so rabidly anti-Trump. I mean, where were the seeds
before
of
Trump.
it?
It started in 2014, I would say. Well, it started in 2011, really, when they erected their online paywall. That's when sociologists have tracked the hockey stick of woke terminology. So up until then, words like, white supremacy, marginalized, privilege, the words people of color in the same sentence as the word marginalized, it was sort of like down here. And then starting in 2011, it became this hockey stick. The frequency of those words just started to skyrocket. And it's because of the way that
in the pages
in
of
the New York
Times.
Times, yes. Sociologists have trawled the archives from 1970 until 2018. And that's when it started. We're still in it, by the way. Why did that happen? Well, digital media. So it turned, when you work in digital media, you're trying to get engagement. And one of the tools for engagement is called SEO, right? Search engine optimization. If you can get your story to be one of the top stories on the first page that Google lists, if someone types in a question, you're going to get a ton of traffic from that, right? And there are tricks to how to do that. Certain keywords, the keyword has to appear in the title and the social description and then 10 words throughout the article, right? So, you could just see how the New York Times figured this out as soon as it went digital, right? As soon as it erected that online paywall and was like, this is our future, they started to do this stuff. And so these words, the word slavery, I mean, come on, like slavery is not getting more frequent, right? But the frequency of that word in the New York Times skyrocketed because they were trying to appeal to an overeducated liberal audience who are obsessed with these concepts because they don't want to talk about income inequality because they're benefiting from income inequality. So they got woke and they want to talk about race and they want to talk about gender so they can still see themselves as the good guys in the social justice battle, right? Without disrupting their enormous economic privilege, right? That's who the New York Times reader is. And they totally leaned in. And then in 2014, they had actually a very bad year. And the current publisher, who was then, just a part of the team, A.G. Salzberger, he was tasked with coming up with their future in what was called the Times Innovation Report. You read that report and it is a beeline for how they got here, how they lost all of their Republican. It was like, he said he wanted reporters to become social media stars. He wanted them to be driving the conversation on social media, which is exactly what happened. They became stars, and then they started demanding that he fire people who they didn't like, and he listened to them. I mean, it's so crazy. They started this thing called Project Feels. that would sell ads based on how emotional they thought an article was going to make the reader, right? Like the whole thing shifted towards becoming, much more of a digital media company, and it led directly to where we are here. All of this is in the book. Anybody who wants to know more details about this in Bad News.
So then what outlets do you read? What outlets do you trust? I mean, you sound like you read a lot of them. What outlets do you trust?
It depends what point of view I want to get. I read all of them. I will say,
because your background, you were at the Forward, you were at Tablet.
Yes.
Then the Forward is the leading Jewish publication in America. The Tablet is, you publish there a lot. So anyway, I interrupted, but go ahead. So who do you trust and who do you like?
Well, I do like Fox News. I do think they're speaking to the working class. Not necessarily from an economic point of view, but from every other point of view. They really do. Now, of course, also from an economic point of view, because they can bash Biden for it. So
right.
They're covering inflation, whereas you won't really see that covered in the liberal papers. But they are speaking to the working class, and I like that. But I wouldn't, you have to balance that with like other
Sure.
things. I will say I've never read something in the Wall Street Journal that I thought was untrue. But like that paper is not for me. It's for rich people. Like I read it every Shabbat, and I feel very poor while I'm reading it. Let me tell you, and I'm not poor. But it's not for me. But I trust everything I read there. Their coverage of China specifically is very, very good. Whereas the coverage in the New York Times reflects that, much more the climate, point of view, which is very pro-China, actually. You have people wanting to bring in these cheap wind turbines from China, like to further like immiserate the working class. So if I only had to read, if I could on Shabbat, I don't use technology. So I'm only reading one paper, and the paper that's coming is the Wall Street Journal. So I really like, there's a populist YouTube show called, Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar. That's very good. I really like the Good Old Boys podcast is really good. What else do I listen to regularly? There's a lot of stuff out there. But for people who it's not their job, like it's my job, I honestly think that it's just like, there's just too much news out there. I really believe there's nothing that a person can learn from the New York Times or CNN that they can't learn from church or from going to the local bodega and asking the owner what's up. And I just think that our media is so nationalized and our national culture is so stymied that it's just, most of it is just trash.
But the positive point, which I think you're making here, is that, and well, I guess my own podcast is that an example is that, and I don't have I'm no Joe Rogan, right? Although I have the same microphone as Joe Rogan, so sure, SM7B. And he lives in Austin. I live in Austin, so I'm almost Joe Rogan. But that the way that the digital media has evolved is that it's flattened the ability for people or like me to get in and have my own platform without fear of being canceled or have some editor say, oh, we don't like this, we're not going to run this. So it's allowed a more voices, I think, into the mix and people to find the voices that they trust and like. So last thing then, Batya, what gives you hope? We've talked about a lot of things that are disappointing, disheartening, frustrating, and I'm bullish on America. I'm a homer in that way. I'm totally on board with America and optimism for America. But what makes you hopeful?
Everything. The American people. I feel very hopeful because they're too smart for their elites and they're turning away from them, and it's so clear. It's just the beauty and the genius and the wisdom and the power and the neighborliness and the goodness of the American people fills me with hope every single day. Every single day. And I just want to be worthy of those people. Like I want to be a force representing their goodness, and the fact that they are not willing to be forced to hate their fellow American because somebody else is making money off of that. Like I just want to be worthy of that and be able to widen the platform for that because it is so good. This is the greatest country on earth, and I really believe the greatest country in history. And this is the promised land, and we're in it. And so I just want to be worthy of that and give more and more voice to that and elevate those people and give them a voice.
We'll stop there then. That's eloquently stated. My guest has been Batya Ungar-Sargon. She has written a remarkable book, one that was surprising to me and one that had many twists and turns that I didn't expect and some great history that I didn't know. Bad News is the book. Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Batya, thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a real pleasure and a real honor for me.
Great. Well, thanks to you. And thanks again to all you in podcast land. Tune into the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.